There's a mineral on your kitchen table right now, and it costs almost nothing. You shake it out without looking. Some of it misses the food, scatters across the wood, and you brush it off without a second thought. Maybe you throw a pinch over your shoulder for luck, out of a habit whose origin nobody in the room could explain. For most of human history, that same mineral was one of the most fought over substances on Earth. People built entire towns on top of it, and one town in the desert was built literally out of it. Walls and roofs cut from solid blocks. Empires taxed it, monopolized it, and went to war over who controlled it. In 1930, a thin man in a plain cotton wrap walked to the sea, bent down, and lifted a handful of it off the mud. And that single quiet gesture shook the largest empire in the world. The mineral is salt. The strange part is not that salt was once valuable. Plenty of ordinary things were once rare. The strange part is how completely we have forgotten why, and how recent that forgetting is. We treat salt as seasoning now, a flavor. The thing a recipe asks for at the very end, in a quantity so small it barely registers on the bill. That framing is a modern accident, and a very young one. For nearly all of the human past, salt was not a flavor at all. It was survival technology, and it may have been the single most important piece of survival technology we ever built our societies around. Start with the body, because that is where the whole story begins. Every animal on Earth runs on sodium. Your nerves fire because sodium moves across the walls of your cells. Your muscles contract on it. Your blood holds its volume because of it. Lose too much through heat or labor or illness, and the body stops working in ways that are quick and final. A hunter eating raw meat and blood takes in all the salt a body needs without ever thinking about it, because the animals they eat did the collecting for them. The trouble starts when people stop hunting and start farming. A diet of grain and vegetables is a diet starved of sodium. So the moment humans settled down, planted fields, and began eating like farmers, they walked straight into a deficiency that the land around them usually could not fix. They needed salt from somewhere, deliberately, for the rest of their lives. Every human being in every farming society, forever. And salt does not grow. It sits in a few specific places. A drying coastline, a buried seam of rock, a briny spring. If you were not near one of those, you had to trade for it, carry it, or take it. That single fact, a universal need meeting a scarce and uneven supply, is the engine under everything that follows. Then there is the second job salt did, the one that made it strategic rather than merely necessary. Before refrigeration, food rotted, and a society that cannot store food cannot store surplus, and a society without surplus cannot field armies, cannot survive a bad winter, cannot send ships across an ocean that takes months to cross. Salt was the answer, and the reason it worked is almost embarrassingly simple. Bury meat or fish in enough of it, and the salt draws the water straight out of the flesh and out of the bacteria trying to live on it. The things that rot food need water to grow. Take the water away and they die, and the food sits there, changed and stable, for months or years. Picture what that actually looked like. A cold northern harbor, tables of split cod laid out under a gray sky, workers rubbing coarse salt into every surface, stacking the fish in layers with more salt between them until a catch that would have gone bad in 3 days could survive a 2-month crossing. That preserved cod is what let European fishing fleets work the far side of the Atlantic and bring the food home hard and dry. The salted herring of the North Sea fed medieval towns straight through the winter. Salted pork provisioned expeditions that were gone for years. None of it was a luxury. It was the difference between a voyage that ended in trade and a voyage that ended in a ship full of dead men. Across most of recorded history, if you wanted to keep food alive through time, salt was very nearly the only tool you had. So hold those two facts together, everyone needs it. It comes from almost nowhere, and on top of that, it unlocks the ability to store the food that everything else depends on. A substance like that does not stay a humble seasoning. It becomes a foundation, and foundations get fought over. Look at what it did to one obscure valley in the Alps. High in the mountains of what is now Austria sits a place called Hallstatt, and there is a salt seam running through the rock beneath it. People began digging that salt out more than 3,000 years ago, hauling it up on wooden staircases, hacking at the walls with bronze tools by the light of pine torches. Archaeologists working the site, led over many years by the Natural History Museum in Vienna, keep pulling extraordinary things out of those tunnels because salt preserves everything it touches: wooden tools, leather, rope, even a miner's fur cap, and the timbers of a staircase, carbon, dated to around 1100 BC, the oldest wooden staircase known in Europe. What the finds reveal is not a handful of villagers scratching at a hole, but an organized industry. The tunnels ran deep into the mountain and demanded a real workforce, hauling broken salt up in hide backpacks, working in shifts by torchlight in a cramped, salty dark. The preserved gear even suggests children were part of it, small enough to move through the narrow galleries, carrying loads out to the surface. This was managed, coordinated, generations deep labor, all of it organized around getting one white mineral out of the rock. And it paid. This should have been a poor, remote mountain village. Instead, the graves nearby are full of imported bronze, amber, and ivory, wealth that had no business being in a hard-to-reach valley in the mountains. The salt paid for all of it. That single resource made an isolated Alpine community rich enough that an entire era of European prehistory, the early Iron Age culture that spread across the continent, is now named after the place, Hallstatt. Rome understood the same thing on a larger scale. One of the oldest roads running out of the city was the Via Salaria, the Salt Road, and it was old before the Republic was. A route worn by traders carrying salt up from the coastal flats near the Tiber's mouth into the interior. You have probably heard that Roman soldiers were paid in salt, and that this is where the word salary comes from. Here I want to be honest, because this channel has been burned before by repeating a clean story that turned out to be too clean. That etymology is disputed. The Latin word salarium is real, and it does seem to connect to salt in some way, possibly an allowance of money to buy it. But the popular image of legionaries handed sacks of salt as wages is almost certainly a later invention. A good story that got repeated until it felt like a fact. What is not in doubt is that Rome took salt seriously enough to build a highway for it, and at times to control its price, so the poor and the army could always afford it. The state had already grasped the lesson the rest of this story keeps teaching. Now, most tellings of salt's history stop somewhere around here, in Europe, with Rome and the Alps. That is exactly the trap, because the same mineral was doing the same work on every inhabited continent, and in some places the scale makes the Alpine mines look small. Cross the Sahara. In the deep desert, at a place called Takaza, there was salt, but almost nothing else. No water worth the name, no food, no shelter, nothing you could live on. Men mine slabs of rock salt. They're in brutal heat, cutting the ground itself into flat gray blocks, and the food they ate had to be carried in across the sand because the site grew nothing. When the traveler Ibn Battuta passed through in the 14th century, he recorded something that sounds invented but was not. The houses and even the mosque were built out of blocks of salt, roofed with camel hide, because salt was the only building material the place had. A whole settlement made of the very thing it existed to sell. From Tagaza, the slabs were roped onto camels, 2 heavy tablets to an animal, and walked south for weeks across open desert toward the edge of the Sahara, into the empires of Mali and the great river cities like Timbuktu that grew fat on the trade. A caravan reaching the market was, in a real sense, carrying money, and the market it reached ran on an exchange that still sounds upside down. Here's the piece people love to repeat and usually overstate. In the gold-rich lands of the Sahel, salt was so scarce and so needed that it could be traded for gold. You will often hear, it was traded ounce for ounce, weight for weight. I could not find solid evidence that the exchange was really one-to-one as a standing rate, And I think the neat equal to gold version is more slogan than record. But the underlying truth holds and barely needs the exaggeration. In a place drowning in gold and desperate for salt, the cheap thing and the precious thing changed places. And the empire that sat on the salt and gold road became one of the wealthiest on earth. Then look at China, where the state took the logic to its cold conclusion first. Under Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty around 919 BC, the Chinese government made salt a state monopoly, not a tax on salt, a monopoly where the state controlled the production and sale of it outright. Because officials had worked out something the rest of the world would take centuries to catch up to. If everyone must buy a thing to stay alive, then selling that thing is the most reliable revenue on earth. You do not need to assess anyone's income or chase anyone's harvest. They will come to you because the alternative is death. Decades later, in 81 BC, the court held a formal debate over whether to keep these monopolies, and a record of it survives, known as the Discourses on Salt and Iron. Scholars argued the state was strangling the people and enriching itself. Officials argued the monopoly was the only thing paying for the defense of the empire. The monopoly stayed. In one form or another, a Chinese state monopoly on salt would persist, on and off for more than 2,000 years. And in one Chinese province, they went to almost unbelievable lengths to reach it. In Sichuan, far inland from any sea, the salt was locked in brine, trapped deep underground. So Chinese engineers learned to drill for it, sinking narrow boreholes by dropping a heavy iron bit on a bamboo cable over and over, day after day, chipping down through solid rock. They had been doing this for well over 1,000 years, and by the 1830s, one well in Sichuan reached roughly 1,000 meters down, the deepest hole drilled anywhere on Earth at the time, centuries before the oil industry would rediscover the same technique. Some of those wells struck pockets of natural gas alongside the brine, and the workers piped it off through bamboo and burned it to boil the salt water down to dry salt. Think about the arithmetic of that. It was worth drilling a kilometer into the planet by hand with a rope and a weight to reach salt. Nothing you would sprinkle on a meal is worth that. Something you cannot live without is. Which brings us to the twist, the thing that was true the whole time, and that the crystals themselves never revealed. Salt's power was never really in the salt. It was in the fact that no one could say no to it. Gold you can refuse. Silk, spices, jewels, all of it optional, all of it the appetite of the rich. Salt is different. The poorest family in the empire needs it exactly as much as the emperor does. It does not grow, so a state or a merchant can get between people and their supply and stand there collecting. That is what every salt empire figured out, from Han China to the Roman price controls to the Saharan caravans. The thing that made salt worth controlling was not that it was precious, it was that it was unrefusable. Salt was, for most of history, the closest thing there was to a tax on being alive. And when a tax lands on being alive, people do not stay quiet forever. France learned this the hard way. For centuries, the French crown ran a salt tax called the gabelle, and it was loathed with a particular intensity, partly because it was so nakedly unfair. The rate was not the same across the country. In some provinces, salt was heavily taxed, in others barely, and in the worst regions, households were forced by law to buy a fixed quantity of salt every year at the inflated price, whether they wanted it or not. Naturally, people smuggled it, carrying cheap salt from the low-tax provinces into the high-tax ones, and the state punished smugglers savagely, with the galleys or worse. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy and wrong to say the salt tax caused the French Revolution. It did not. But the gabelle sat high on the long list of grievances that helped bring the crown down. A small daily injustice that touched every table in the country, and when the revolution came, abolishing it was one of the early demands. And then, almost 2 centuries later, on the other side of the world, salt became a weapon of a very different kind. The British colonial government in India held a monopoly on salt and taxed it. making it illegal for ordinary Indians to gather or make their own, even from the sea that surrounded them. In 1930, Gandhi chose that law of all the injustices available to him as the one to break. He walked to the coast at Dandi, a march of some 240 miles, and when he reached the sea, he simply picked up a lump of natural salt left by the evaporating water. It was, technically, a crime. It was also a perfect piece of theater because it dramatized the whole obscenity in a single image. An empire that claimed the right to tax a man for taking salt out of his own ocean. Tens of thousands followed his example. The march did not end British rule on its own, but it became one of the defining moments of the movement that eventually did. And it worked precisely because everyone, everywhere, understood in their gut that salt should belong to whoever needs it. So, why did all of this vanish from memory? Why is the mineral that built fortunes and toppled taxes now the cheapest thing in your cupboard? Because in the 19th and 20th centuries, two things happened almost at once. Industry learned to mine and produce salt at enormous scale, cheaply. So the scarcity was that gave salt its power simply evaporated, and refrigeration arrived, which quietly retired salt's other great job, the preservation of food, and handed it to the machine humming in your kitchen. Strip away the scarcity and strip away the strategic role, and what is left is seasoning, a flavor, a pinch at the end of a recipe. The whole terrifying importance of the thing collapsed inside a couple of generations, and it collapsed so thoroughly that we now use worth its salt as a phrase and cannot feel the weight that used to be in it. That collapse is the part worth carrying out of here. Salt did not become unimportant because it stopped mattering to our bodies. You need exactly as much sodium today as a Hallstatt miner did. It became invisible because we solved the problem so completely that the problem disappeared from view. And with it went any memory that there had ever been a problem at all. That is what total success looks like. Not celebration, forgetting. We still do this constantly. Every age has its salt, some ordinary looking substance that quietly decides who is powerful because everyone needs it and it comes from only a few places. For a long time, it was salt itself. Later, it was oil. Right now, people are drawing new maps of the world around lithium and a handful of rare metals. For exactly the same reason the old maps were drawn around salt springs and desert mines. The specific mineral changes. The shape of the story does not. People smuggled it, rioted over it, built cities out of it, and walked to the sea to defy an empire for the right to lift it off the sand. Now it sits in a shaker on the table, the one thing in the whole room nobody bothers to guard.